Hello everyone and welcome to episode 4 of my third series of real-time painting tutorials for the miniatures from the A Song of Ice and Fire tabletop game. In this series I've been painting Ramsay Bolton, the Greatjon Umber, and Gregor Clegane, the Mountain That Rides. In these episodes, we go in real time over some of the techniques that I use while I paint these miniatures, giving you the chance to follow through with every single brush stroke at various times, or skip ahead to parts that particularly interest you or that you're working on at any particular point in time. In this episode, we're going to be doing something a little interesting insofar as we're going to be working from an early mixture of sort of a light gray ink that we'll be using to cover gray areas like cloaks that we want on our miniatures, forward into a beige, and finally to brown areas. So in a single sitting, that's about a half hour long, as you can see from the length of the video, I actually covered several different areas on the miniatures all at once, which is pretty time efficient. And if there's one thing that all of these sort of techniques that I use and I'm trying to show here are, or at least they're intended to be, is fairly time efficient. We're not painting for your Golden Demon Awards and stuff here, much as I think these techniques are applicable to higher level painting, very much so. I'm painting to get miniatures on the table around a schedule of work and maybe for you school or anything else that's going on with you. So starting off here, I'm making up a really quick, really thin light gray using some of my white ink and black ink from my P.H. Martin's India ink set, and then adding some Vallejo Flow Improver to that to just, improve the flow of it. If you want to know a little bit more about Flow Improver, I do mention it in a few other episodes, including the one immediately preceding this. So pop back there and take a look in the index in the description of the video if you want to see where the Flow Improver is discussed. Suffice to say, the Flow Improver here helps to thin out our ink and improve its flow, improve its surface tension so that we can work with it particularly lightly. When you're working with light inks, this white ink in particular, you do want to make sure that you've got really, really good control over where it's going, because white ink that you just kind of like let flow freely on its own is going to flow to deep recesses on the miniature, and unfortunately that's going to make your recesses actually paler than your raised edges, which is the inverse of the shading effect that we're trying to get with our inks here. As such, I put a little bit of thinner in there to help improve the flow and to help me push it around really well with my brush and make sure that I'm getting just the thinnest amount. I'm just trying to color over the cloak of the miniature here and dye it a little more gray and sort of muddy that speckled effect I got from airbrushing my zenithal highlights on at the very start of this video. Without actually, saturating it, like putting on a full-on layer that's going to black out that gradient from light to dark that our zenithal highlighting gave us. Ideally, as this dries, we're still going to see a little bit of that gradient through in the background, and that's going to help give this a little more depth. Now, if you've been painting miniatures for a little while, you've probably seen that doing white or light gray or something like this is actually extremely challenging, because getting a smooth gradient and getting it to have nice depth is quite difficult, and I'm still experimenting with it myself. This here is just one more experiment I'm doing in terms of how to get a good gray cloak. Frankly, I think it turned out quite well, and if you take a look at the images of the finished product that are at the start or end of this video, hopefully you agree as well, and if you do, then this is how I did it. Unfortunately, in this video, I do have a few moments where the camera goes out of focus because I was trying to punch out, a half-hour sitting of painting all at once. I did, unfortunately, neglect to refocus my phone camera a couple of times. I still film with a manual phone camera, or with manual focus on my phone camera, because otherwise it tends to focus in on my hands rather than the miniature whenever I'm working up close like this. Although, of course, that has the disadvantage of just not following my focus when I bring the miniature closer to my face or further away. So, bit of a toss-up, but I do apologize when that happens. Hopefully you can still follow along. You can see I'm trying to be fairly precise, and I'm not using a particularly large brush despite having a reasonably large area to cover at the moment, because I don't want that light gray to spill over onto other things. I know that it would get wicked up very quickly if it did spill over onto other areas. And also partly, as I mentioned, because I'm trying to keep a lot of control over my brush as I apply it. If I let it settle into the recesses the way that the ink is kind of want to do, rather than just dyeing the surface the way we're doing here. Like, it's so thin, it really is just coloring the surface of the miniature, rather than like pooling it on the way I was doing with the red in the last episode, where I was really comfortable just laying it on thick so that it would sink in. Here I'm really getting a thin layer, and I'm just hoping that pigment dyes the surface of the miniature, gives it a different color, but keeps that underlying shading that our azimuthal highlighting did for us earlier on when we were just priming the miniature, actually. Trying to be really efficient with the work there. Now here I'm doing Ramsey's trousers, and I'm also going to sort of touch some onto the fur at the cowl of his cloak. What I want is I want a sort of gray, like woven fur around his cloak, because Ramsey's from the north, right? And the north is sort of, well, it's northerly. They've got wolves. They got the dire wolves, obviously, as a big plot point, and they got all that sort of wildlife of a northern sort of stereotypical not Scotland kind of thing, right? So I figure, even though, you know, Ramsey's sort of the bad guy in the north, and in this he's a mercenary character, not actually a character of quote-unquote the north, the faction of the Song of Ice and Fire tabletop game, I still wanted that to tie back up there. Obviously, you know, the Greatjon Umber is also from the north, but I'm going to be a little more comfortable maybe being more experimental with his furs, because he's just a big burly dude and he makes you think of a bear. So we're going to get a sort of brown fur effect on him. I did get a little bit of my gray ink onto the red cloak, both on the back and on the front. And I'm going to do the usual thing that you'll see me do throughout my videos. If there's one thing that these real-time painting videos hopefully do, is show you that mistakes happen pretty regularly, you know. Well, here I'm taking some of my flow improver, getting it onto a clean brush, and I'm just trying to like wick and wipe away any of the gray ink that's gotten into locations I didn't want it. As I mentioned, unfortunately, it's a little hard to see here because my focus sort of went out while I was working on it, because I was pulling it a little closer up to my face so that I could see what I'd done wrong. But I'm just applying a really sort of just a clean brush with some flow improver, using the flow improver to lightly thin the inks that I've gotten in the wrong place, while the clean brush itself absorbs them up, or absorbs up the pigment. You'll see that a clean brush, when inserted into sort of a wet substance, generally ink or paint or something, wicks it up into the bristles. That's why we have bristles on the end, and it's not just like the stiff thing. However, the longer you let it sit, for example, this ink on the front of the cloak was sitting there for quite a while, the more dry it's going to get and the harder it is going to be to wick away with your brush. So in this case, you can see that unfortunately I let it sit too long, and just using the wicking technique was not sufficient to remove all of that gray. In fact, all I did was smudge it around. So I'm just going to really quickly whip out my red ink and my magenta ink, remix it up, and cover that up pretty quickly. Covering things up like this could be, you know, it could be a pretty quick thing to do, but it may also be daunting, because what you're going to get is it's going to look a little patchy. There's a couple of things you need to remember when you're doing this. Is number one, if you're going to do this and you don't want it to look patchy, cover a wider area than what you're actually just trying to cover up, so that it can sort of blend into the broader, in this case the broader red of his cloak. So I'm covering all the way to the edges, not just trying to cover up the one place that was gray. I'm also going ahead and applying this red and magenta mixture pretty freely, so that it sort of gets into the crevices a little better than it would have otherwise, and also so that it blends better in behind, makes the whole thing look more vibrant. I'm taking advantage of it to sort of punch up the color on that section of the cloak. It was looking a little low saturation anyway. The next thing I'm going to be doing is I'm going ahead and trying to give a gray cloak to the Greatjon as well. In this case, because my intention is to give him sort of a grizzly bear pelt to sort of speak to how big and tough he is here, the gray I think would contrast well. He's got like a red tabard on the front, he's going to have a lot of brown leather, he's going to have a brown cloak, so giving him a sort of like even just a dun cloak, like a beige one, I don't think would have been all that interesting. So I'm just going to go ahead and go with gray here. Gray on its own isn't really an interesting color, but when you're coloring miniatures, you should always try to keep in mind that you're trying to break up the colors. You're not trying to have two super similar colors right adjacent to each other, because your colors are what actually gives shape to the miniature when you're looking at it from a long distance away. There's this saying among tabletop wargamers, you talk about the 3-foot rule when you're talking about your painted miniatures, which is to say, like, a lot of the time when you're playing, you're going to be looking at them from like 3 feet away. You're not going to be looking at them right up in your face. Yeah, obviously the first time you show your miniatures to a friend, especially a friend who's never played, but even friends who have played and have painted miniatures, they're going to want to compare them. So they're going to want to pull them up and look at them up close and see the face and be like, oh, you didn't paint pupils, or you did, or whatever. But the 90% of the actual gaming you're going to get done with your miniatures is going to be done from like 3 feet away. So if they don't look good at 3 feet away, I mean, it's up to you. Certainly you could paint every little detail on a miniature and sort of you could do it really photorealistic, and up close it'll look amazing. But I've certainly seen some of those where at tabletop distance then they'd look kind of muddy because there's a lot of stuff painted that's in very similar colors. And yeah, I get it, it's gritty and there's brown because there's mud everywhere, and up close it really does look like great spackling on the armor, but from far away it just looks gray. So, it's a matter of style, but I do try to keep that sort of theory in mind, that I'm trying to make really bold, broad areas that break it apart and make it look like a guy from a distance. Here, I've just put some brown and yellow into my gray mixture, and you can see we're slowly starting to work that gray mixture. We're going from it just being gray to now it being beige. And I'm just using what's on my palette to sort of fill in areas on the miniature. Obviously, you have a color plan, or you should aim to have a color plan for your miniatures ahead of time, because having a plan will help you actually paint it effectively and efficiently. But I certainly I don't hold like a full image in my head, and there are small areas like the sleeves here that sometimes just get missed when I'm painting the miniature, and in this case, at the very least, I just filled them in with beige because that's what I had at the time, and I thought it would look kind of cool. Then from the beige, now I'm just thinning out my brown, and it's still got a little bit of yellow mixed into it. You can see there's sort of blending on the palette there. So that's going to give me a sort of interesting off brown, and that's what I'm going to be using for a lot of the leather areas as we work our way forwards here. So I'm throwing it over, his gloves and the grip of his sword, which I'm imagining is wrapped in leather, because what could be more barbaric and also kind of practical, So I'm throwing that on. These gauntlets here, I sort of envisioned them having that metal framework on the back for some reason, I guess, but hey, it was sculpted on there. So I don't know, they could also be just hockey gloves, like those old school ones, with the big, tough areas underneath the leather. But in this case, I'm going with a metal framework, because I think it'd be kind of cool, use that to bat away swords or something. Whatever. It's a fantasy character, and at least the metal is going to break up the shapes on the gauntlet. If you left that whole area brown, it wouldn't really show. So again, going back to the 3-foot rule, I'm going to make those details pop a little bit by making them metallic later. I'm also now starting off this grizzly bear fur by throwing on this brownish yellow mixture, and you can see as I apply more and more of it, it's blending more and more on the palette, and it's getting more and more yellow, and that's blending from top to bottom, from that brown that I added initially to this more mustardy color at the bottom. I think it's going to be a cool blending effect, and we're going to play with that a little more later as well, as we try to pull all the colors together and get what we want out of it, really. I'm going all the way over his shoulders with the bare arms, and again, that brown area right at the shoulders is now blending forward into yellow as it gets close to the extremities. It does look kind of cool. It's very subtle by the time we're done to this miniature, though, so take it or leave it. This might be an idea that you want to use later as a really rudimentary form of wet blending colors. If you're literally blending them on your palette and then working outwards from a point, you're going to get a bit of a blend in the colors. It's going to look kind of cool. If that's something you want to work into your plans for your miniatures, then definitely it could be a very nice idea. Here again, I'm just wicking away some color that got out of line as best I can. My other brush was a little saturated from before, so now I'm using a different brush and just getting up in the cracks. The fur here, right at its raggedy edges, isn't going to hold the ink very well, because the ink's going to try to go to the crevices, but obviously on the ragged edges, the crevices are past the fur. The fur is the crests, the actual tendrils of fur sticking out. So you want to clean up around the edges a little bit so you still get that ragged edge look later when it dries. Just going to do an all-around look here for more errors, because obviously there could be many. And I'm pouring out a little more brown here. I'm thinning all my inks because I'm trying to get some really subtle colors. This isn't necessarily something you want to do all the time. I'm still learning as I go, just like anyone. And I did, in relative terms, only start miniature painting again fairly recently. So it's something I was sort of trying out there, thin it out quite a lot. And what that does do is for this azimuthal highlighting, thinning out your inks that much is going to make sure that your azimuthal highlighting, like the work you put into that, is going to show up. But it also means the color can be a little more finicky. Like you're not going to have as much color on any particular area. You can see it on the toes of the boots here. Yes, the primer is showing through, but the primer is showing through so much it's almost not looking brown. It does look quite good in the right places, but definitely don't always thin your inks. Your inks are already thin and they're already kind of a wash. So if you want more vibrant colors, I wouldn't recommend thinning them every time, but in this case where I wanted a worn leather look on the Greatjon, I gave it a shot and I do think it worked out in the end. I was also a little shy while I was doing these miniatures because this was the first time I'd ever done an azimuthal highlight with an airbrush. So I really didn't want that work to go to waste by just covering it up, and certainly even using unthinned inks isn't like, I don't know, slathering on an acrylic paint and just totally covering up the detail, but it would have potentially obscured it a little bit, at least was my mindset. The reality is since then I have painted many other miniatures using the azimuthal highlighting technique and I have started thinning my inks far less frequently. So yeah, take it or leave it. Here I was really noticing that effect where I had this highly thinned brown ink and on the really narrow areas that I needed to paint, because I wasn't going to be able to just let the ink settle over top. I really just needed it to die as I wiped over. So I got some unthinned brown and went over those. And now I have to touch up the boots because they were a little light, and touch up the gloves. Yeah, thin your paints is definitely very, very good advice. And you'll see that sort of as a running joke very, very often whenever you're looking for help painting online. Oh, thin your paints, oh, thin your paints. It will give you a little more control. It will give you a little, it'll give you a better effect. It'll let your primer show through, but it'll also take away some control if you go too thin, insofar as it'll be exceptionally runny. And also it'll... well, it just won't color the things the way you want it to. It won't settle where you want it to. When I was working on the Greatjon's face here, I'm being particularly careful to avoid the beard and the hair. I don't want to, lose those details since I've already got them in a gray primer. I want to be able to work from that gray primer since I'm trying to give him an old man look anyway, right? So don't spill over too much. I'm also doing the scabbard now with this unadulterated brown because... I want the scabbard to stand out from the grizzly fur, and the grizzly fur got that sort of yellow-brown mustard look. So by using this other brown, even though they're two browns, they sort of stand out from each other. It works out. I'm also going to be using this brown to go over all of the areas on his skirts there. Although I do realize later they're they're lamellar pieces of metal, really, in the art book. So I will go over them with metallic paint later. But the brown at least fills in the cracks between them and helps give them a little bit of contrast as well. Especially around the edges, that brown's still going to be visible all the way to the end because I'm going to keep that as sort of a leather rim around the giant lamels of metal that make up his skirt there. You can see on this larger area, the thinned brown is really not... it's collecting in the crevices very, very well. It hasn't given it that rich brown that you would get if you were just using it straight up. In this case, again, kind of the effect I was going for, kind of not. 50-50. The plus side to having an extremely thinned paint, of course, is that you can always add more paint, but it's very, very difficult to take it away if you've put on too much. So, you can always put on more coats. It's sort of like cutting, they always say measure twice, cut once. With the paints, if you want to be super cautious, and you want to get the smoothest finish possible as well, using highly thinned paints or inks is kind of your best bet. You will get an extremely smooth finish if you're willing to use highly, highly thinned paints and go over it multiple times. And you may even find that essential if you're doing things like acrylic paints yellow. I've never found a yellow acrylic paint that looked particularly good, particularly not on the first application, which is kind of why I use the inks now. That ink, if you'll recall, painting Gregor in, I think it was episode 2 of this series, he actually got really good coverage and a really nice yellow just from that first application. And the inks have been wonderful for that. Their ability to just dye the primer underneath a different color instead of having to apply as a totally separate layer over top and coat it to get a color really changes the dynamic for these paints in a good way. Here again, brown, these are fantasy characters. I think I've mentioned this and or made a joke about it in every one of these series so far, but fantasy characters have a lot of brown. It's like the color of choice. There's just leather everywhere, and part of that is me playing to these fantasy stereotypes insofar as I could get fancy and say, oh yes, well, he's gonna have dyed leather or red gloves or something. But to be fair, the brown here does help break up the miniatures, by adding a belt partway down, by adding these gauntlets. Brown's also the base color I use for skin, so brown just kind of goes on everywhere. It spreads the colors out a little bit. And yeah, it does look like, the stereotypical fantasy deal. I'll also caveat that real leather isn't really this brown that I'm putting on everything. Certainly not when it's been used and worn or whatever, unless it's been dyed specifically to that color. But we are painting to expectations here, and brown just sort of says leather, if that makes any sense. It speaks to that color and to that texture, especially the brown ink applied over this gray primer, where it gets those sort of scuffed light edges all on the corners due to the ink flowing away from them. I think it looks really good for leather. And it definitely achieves the effect of leather, which is the important part when you're painting miniatures, of course, is to impart sort of the look that you're going for. On Gregor Clegane, there's quite a few little areas you're going to want to touch up with the leather, like strapping on himself, his saddle, his horse. All of these are small areas, so again, I'm using a small brush. If I were doing this exact same thing in the future again, I would preferably use less watered down ink, because you can already see I'm going over the same areas, a few times. And it's just not efficient. And I'm also sort of worried that this brown is going to run off and ruin that beautiful yellow that I was just talking about. So, yeah, like anything else, right? You'll find out about a certain technique or a certain thing that you could do, and you'll just do it to excess until you realize sort of where it belongs and in your actual toolbox. And at this point I had gone, oh yeah, thinning. Thinning's a thing you do, so I'm going to thin everything. Obviously it's not a really good practice, but it is kind of a thing that we all tend to do, so just keep that in mind, like people are trying to learn a thing, people are going to stick to, their one trick that they've just learned. But that's not to say it was all bad. I certainly wasn't disadvantaged by thinning out this brown overly much. And I think thinning out the brown does give you a really nice sort of extra worn leather look. So that's still in my toolbox. I would just say there's a few of these places where I probably would have gone with less thinned brown just to make sure that I had better control over the flow of it and I was getting better coverage without having to go back to it multiple times. Especially areas like this where you're having to reach awkwardly through the miniature to get to, the saddle. And you're holding it at a weird angle, so stuff could flow in ways you don't want it to. Be aware of the properties of your ink. In this case, I didn't have any incidents, so I definitely wasn't, playing myself too hard. But it's just on my mind when I rewatch the footage. 2 months later or something, a little while after I actually do the painting, is when the footage actually sort of gets processed into these real-time tutorials. So, yeah, I'm rewatching it with a new mind. I've done some more painting since then. I've tried some new things. I've seen other videos on YouTube that have different tutorials. There's a whole lot of knowledge accumulation that happens just from being part of a hobby or participating in something. And yeah, it kind of changes how I look at what I was doing then. Not to say it was wrong, just to say if I was doing this exact same project again, I probably would have done it differently. And that's interesting to me, and hopefully it's kind of interesting to you. I mean, if you are, 24 minutes into listening to me ramble about this kind of stuff, then I would imagine it is interesting to you, and I hope it's stimulated some thought about the process and the subject for you. This part is exceptionally tricky because I now have a wet gray paint, which will obviously want to wick stuff away if I touch it with this brown at all. And then I've got the yellow on either side, and it's like threading a needle. And I like cringed watching myself do it right there, just for fear that this runny brown ink would escape and just ruin everything. But yeah, I'm going back over a whole bunch of places to try and get a better brown, more coverage. Now I'm getting some yellow to work on the barding of the horse, and this is another great example of that I learned a new trick, I'm sticking to it kind of thing. I'm chucking this yellow down, mixing it in with a little bit of brown, and then firing in some more flow improver. Absolutely unnecessary. Be conscious about what you're trying to achieve. Yellow is an incredibly thin color. Yellow does not need to be thinned. Very, very rarely does yellow need to be thinned. Especially when I'm trying to get a slightly off yellow, which I almost always try to do because a warmer yellow, like a browner yellow, just looks better. Putting some thinner into it means, look at that first brush stroke. There was nothing there. There was no color. It barely even dyed the primer. It certainly didn't match up with any of the yellow that I'd applied previously. That was just a bad habit at work, right? So keep in mind that kind of stuff. You learned a new trick, and it's great, and it probably does great things for you. But don't just use it blindly every time you can, because there are probably some times where maybe your old tricks were just fine, or maybe just in that particular situation it's not ideal, and there's a different new trick you should be applying. Here now I've added even more yellow, and so it's not really an off yellow anymore. It is just straight up yellow, but it's sitting fairly well on the primer, and it's matching up fairly well with the other areas of yellow on the miniature, so I'm just going to carry on with just straight up yellow. My yellow and brown are normally matched together quite closely, and you can see that I'm drawing some yellow off to get that off yellow sort of coloration again from my previous drip of brown there. Yellow and brown for me, at least from this ink set, if you're using the same ink set as me, you're probably going to end up doing very similar things. But the yellow and brown are tight at the hip, because the brown on its own is a little flat. It's great for, insignificant details like just the leather belts or something. But the yellow makes it pop a little bit if you put in just a little bit. If you put in quite a bit, you can get sort of a beige, dirty brown color, like for gambazons and stuff like that. And if you put in even more yellow and you get this like off yellow, all of a sudden your yellow, which is basically highlighter colored if you use it straight out of the bottle, is now cut down just a little bit. And its shaded areas look just a little bit more shaded because the brown kind of collects there. The brown's still warm, the brown's still like it's a little less aggressive than adding a big vivid red or something, but it stays in the same warm side of the color wheel. And so it gives you the perfect kind of shading to give depth to your yellow as you use it, because otherwise, yeah, it's like fluorescent ink. It's insane. Definitely not appropriate for the vast majority of medieval characters at the very least. So now here, my brown, I've got some brownish yellow on the palette. I'm just going to touch some stuff up, and we are done this sitting. That's it for now. Thanks for sticking through that if you got all the way through the whole thing. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed yourselves, as per usual. That is the goal of this. If you got any questions about anything here or anything in any of the other videos, throw them down in the comment section or get in touch with me on Facebook or on Instagram. I'd love to answer some questions. I'd love to have some suggestions for what you guys like to see as we go forward with the channel. I do this as a hobby on the side, but I'd be happy to do slightly more detailed videos. They just might be more infrequent than once a week. I do think this real-time thing is useful. I personally love rewatching my stuff in real time, and I love finding other people's real-time tutorials where I can follow along with every single brush stroke and really get into the nitty-gritty of what they're doing. If you guys like that, let me know. If you don't, we can work on something else. World's our oyster. But anyway, thanks again for watching, and go play some games.